It was a bright afternoon in the bustling city square, filled with people going about their business. The sun shone brightly on the grand buildings surrounding the square, and the air was filled with the sound of distant chatter and the clinking of street vendors selling their goods. The streets were crowded, as they often were during the royal events that took place every few months. This particular day was no different, and it felt like the whole city had gathered to witness the royal parade that was taking place just down the road. Among the busy crowd was Emma, a young woman who had lived in the city her whole life. She had always loved the energy of the place, but there was one thing she couldn't stand: the royal guards. Emma didn't have anything against them personally, but their presence always felt like a reminder of something she didn't agree with: the old traditions and the way the royal family ruled over the people. She walked through the square, her steps quick as she tried to make her way to the small cafe on the corner. As she walked, she noticed the royal guards stationed at different points throughout the square. Their bright, polished uniforms and stern faces always caught her eye. They stood like statues, tall and imposing, watching over the crowd with unwavering focus. Emma felt a spark of irritation rise in her chest. She hated the way the guards seemed to think they were above everyone else, standing there with such pride and authority. To Emma, they represented everything she didn't like about the system that controlled their lives. The guards never showed any emotion. They were stoic, silent, and rigid in their duty. For some reason, their presence always made her feel small and insignificant. As Emma approached one of the guards, she wasn't paying close attention to where she was walking. She was deep in thought, her mind racing with frustrations about the day. The guard, a tall man with dark hair and a serious expression, stood blocking her path. Without realizing it, she bumped into him, the sudden jolt snapping her out of her thoughts. "Excuse me," Emma muttered, trying to step around him. But the guard didn't move. He remained still, his gaze fixed on the crowd in front of him, completely unbothered by her presence. This only irritated Emma more. She paused, staring at the guard for a moment, her patience growing thin. She wasn't used to being ignored like this. She took a deep breath, her frustration bubbling to the surface. The streets were crowded, and she was late for her appointment, but it felt like the guard had chosen this moment to stand in her way. "Can you move?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. The guard didn't respond. His eyes never left the crowd. Emma's frustration grew into anger, and before she knew it, her hand shot out, slapping the guard's arm. The action was quick, a reflex born out of her annoyance, but it was done. She stood there, eyes wide, shocked by what she had just done. For a moment, there was silence. The crowd seemed to pause, the air thick with tension. Emma's heart raced, and a sinking feeling settled in her stomach as she realized what she had just done. She slapped a royal guard. What was she thinking? The slap echoed in the square, loud and sharp, causing a ripple of whispers among the crowd. Emma's hand hung in the air for a moment, as if she was still processing what had just happened. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she immediately felt a wave of regret wash over her. What had come over her? How could she have done something so reckless? The royal guard stood still, unmoving. His face was still as stone, his expression unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't react at all. For a second, Emma thought he hadn't even noticed the slap. But that wasn't the case. His body was tense, and his eyes narrowed slightly. But he didn't say a word. The silence that followed felt suffocating. The crowd around them grew quieter, waiting for something to happen. Emma stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. She hadn't expected this reaction. She hadn't expected him to remain so calm. "Move," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. All she wanted was to escape the intense heat of the moment, to disappear into the crowd, and forget it ever happened. But the guard didn't budge. His eyes finally met hers, steady and unwavering. His expression remained the same, stoic, composed, and utterly calm. Emma felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. The crowd was staring, some with curiosity, others with judgment. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, and it made her skin crawl. The more she stood there, the more she wished she could rewind time and take back that impulsive slap. I'm sorry," Emma stammered, her voice trembling as she looked up at the guard. Her apology seemed small and weak in the face of his cold silence. The words felt inadequate, but she had no idea what else to say. She had done something wrong, and she knew it. There was no excusing it now. The guard didn't speak, didn't give any sign that he accepted her apology. He simply stood there, his posture as rigid as ever. It was like he was made of stone, unyielding to her words, unbothered by her actions. Emma didn't know whether to feel relieved or more anxious. His lack of response made the situation feel worse, not better. The tension in the air grew heavier with every passing second, and Emma could feel the eyes of the onlookers burning into her. As the seconds stretched on, Emma's mind raced. What would happen now? Would he take action? Would there be consequences for what she had done? She glanced around, half expecting someone to step forward, maybe one of the other guards, or a higher-ranking official. But no one moved. It was as if time had stopped in that moment, and all the noise of the busy square had faded into the background. Emma's chest tightened as she realized there were cameras around. People had been filming the entire incident. She could already imagine how the video would spread on social media, the headlines, the comments, the judgment. It was all out of her control now, and the realization made her stomach twist. How could she have let her frustration get the best of her like that? In that instant, she wished she could disappear, vanish from the square, and never have to face anyone again. But there was no escaping the reality of what had just happened. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Emma stood frozen in place, her heart racing and her mind in turmoil. The crowd around them had gone still, and she could feel their eyes burning into her, waiting for something to happen. She had never felt more exposed in her life. The moment felt like it was happening in slow motion, but in reality, only a few seconds had passed since her impulsive action. The royal guard didn't flinch. His face remained as calm and unreadable as ever. His posture was perfect, strong and unyielding, like he had been trained for this exact kind of situation. Emma couldn't even tell if he was angry or surprised. His complete lack of reaction made everything worse. It made her feel like a child who had just thrown a tantrum, only to be met with cold indifference. The crowd, however, was not silent. People around them were whispering, exchanging shocked glances, some even pulling out their phones to record the scene. Emma's face turned bright red. She didn't care about the crowd's whispers, though. It was the fact that the moment had been captured on video that scared her the most. She could already imagine the headlines, the comments, the ridicule she would face for losing her temper in front of the whole city. It felt like her whole life was about to be laid bare for everyone to judge. Her hand trembled as she instinctively took a step back. "I didn't mean to," she began, but her words were barely audible. What could she say to make it better? What could she possibly do to undo the damage? A single slap, a moment of rage, and now she had drawn all this attention to herself. The guard's eyes were still locked on her, steady and unblinking. It was almost as if he were studying her. Emma couldn't stand the intensity of his gaze. Her nerves were getting the best of her, and she felt like she was about to explode. She wanted to explain herself, to tell him that she wasn't a troublemaker, that this wasn't who she was. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped behind the growing sense of panic. "I'm sorry," she finally managed to say, the words coming out in a rush. I didn't mean to do that." Her voice wavered, and she quickly looked away, unable to meet his eyes any longer. She couldn't believe what she had just done. It had been a knee-jerk reaction, something born out of frustration, but it had been completely uncalled for. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a way to make it right. Could she apologize again? Would he even care? The guard remained silent, still unmoving. Emma couldn't decide whether to be relieved or more anxious. His silence was making everything feel worse. She had expected something, anything, from him, but he simply stood there, like a wall of stone, not reacting in any way. Emma felt her stomach churn as the reality of the situation sank in. She had slapped a royal guard. And now, there was no going back. The crowd continued to watch. Some were even daring to record the moment. And Emma could hear faint murmurs of disbelief. She wanted to run, to disappear into the crowd, and forget this ever happened. But her legs felt like they were made of lead. She couldn't move. She was trapped in the awkwardness of the situation, and the guard's stillness made her feel even more helpless. The seconds seemed to stretch on forever, each one adding to the weight of the moment. All Emma wanted was to forget the whole incident, but she knew that wasn't possible. This moment, this mistake, would follow her for a long time. Emma's apology hung in the air, barely audible. As she stood there, her face flushed with embarrassment. The silence that followed felt endless, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Her mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. She had always prided herself on being calm and collected, yet here she was, standing in front of a royal guard, having slapped him in front of an entire crowd. The thought of it made her stomach twist. She looked around, seeing the wide eyes of the people nearby. Some were still filming, others were whispering to each other. The cameras and phones capturing every moment felt like 1,000 eyes were watching her. It was like being on display, her every move scrutinized. She could already picture the comments that would flood social media, the judgment that would follow her for days, weeks, even months. She couldn't escape it. The thought of the video going viral made her want to crawl into a hole and hide. Her eyes flicked back to the guard. He hadn't moved a muscle. He was still standing there, tall and unmoving, his expression unchanged. His silence was maddening. She had expected something, a reprimand, an angry word, maybe even a response that would let her know what to do next. But nothing. His complete lack of reaction was unsettling, and it only made her feel worse. She took a small, shaky step back, her hands still trembling. What had possessed her to act like that? It had been such a stupid thing to do. In that moment, she realized how impulsive and thoughtless her actions had been. Her frustration, which had built up from the crowds, from the heat, from everything that felt out of her control, had led to this one stupid decision. A decision she couldn't take back. I'm really sorry, she said again, this time with more force, trying to sound sincere. Her voice cracked a little, and she hated herself for it. Why couldn't she just handle this with dignity? Why had she let her emotions get the better of her? The guard didn't acknowledge her apology. He didn't nod, didn't say a word. Nothing. He stood like a statue, silent and unmoving, and Emma felt as though her heart was sinking deeper with each passing second. Was he going to get angry? Was he going to make her regret this even more? She didn't know. The uncertainty made her feel even more vulnerable. Her mind flashed to the potential consequences. The guards were there to uphold the law, to protect the royal family and their citizens. Slapping one of them wasn't something that could be taken lightly. What if the guard decided to report her? What if she got into serious trouble for her outburst? She hadn't thought about any of this in the heat of the moment. The silence stretched out, but Emma couldn't bear it any longer. She wanted the moment to end. She needed to escape the embarrassment, to somehow make things right, even though she knew she couldn't undo what had happened. Her hands clenched into fists by her sides, her heart still racing in her chest. She was caught in this awkward, uncomfortable space, and there didn't seem to be any way out. For the briefest moment, Emma considered just walking away, pretending like nothing had happened. But the thought of doing that only made her feel worse. Running away wouldn't solve anything. She had to face the consequences, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Emma stood there, her breath shallow, her hands still trembling at her sides. Every second felt like an eternity. She couldn't read the guard's face at all. He remained as calm and emotionless as when she had first bumped into him. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the slap had never occurred. His lack of response made her feel even more exposed, more uncomfortable. She was waiting for him to say something, anything, but he didn't. The silence between them stretched on, suffocating and full of tension. She opened her mouth to speak again, but no words came out. What could she say? She had already apologized twice, but the guard hadn't even acknowledged it. He hadn't moved a muscle. The crowd continued to watch, their eyes flicking back and forth between Emma and the guard. Some whispered, others recorded the moment on their phones. It felt like the whole square was waiting for something to happen. She could feel every eye on her, and the pressure was unbearable. Finally, after what seemed like forever, the guard took a small step to the side. It wasn't an aggressive move, but it was a shift that broke the silence. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Was this his way of dismissing her? Was he letting her go without punishment? Her mind raced with possibilities, but he didn't say anything. He just moved aside, allowing her to walk past him. It was a simple action, but to Emma, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off her shoulders. But as she took a step forward, a new wave of panic swept over her. The situation wasn't over. The crowd was still watching, and the guards around them had noticed the exchange. Emma's cheeks flushed with embarrassment again. She had slapped one of the royal guards, and even if he wasn't making a scene about it, the event had already left a mark. What if the other guards reacted differently? What if they decided to intervene? Her feet felt glued to the ground, and she hesitated, unsure of what to do next. The guard's eyes followed her as she slowly moved away. He didn't stop her. He didn't do anything. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unsettled, still unresolved. Her hands clenched into fists, and her mind spun in circles, trying to process everything. She hadn't expected him to just let her walk away. She hadn't expected him to remain silent for so long. His composure only added to the strangeness of the situation. Emma's gaze flicked around the square, hoping to see someone else step in, to guide her through this awkward moment. But no one moved. People were still whispering, their attention fully on her. The crowd was still buzzing, still unsure how to react. Was it because they had seen something shocking, or because they didn't know how to handle what had just occurred? The moment had unfolded so quickly, and now it was hanging in the air like a cloud. The more Emma thought about it, the more the regret settled in. She had acted without thinking, and now she was left with nothing but a deep sense of discomfort. The guard's silence made her question everything. Did he see her as just another person who had broken the rules? Or did he understand that she hadn't meant any harm? No matter the answer, Emma knew one thing for sure. This would be a day she would never forget. As Emma slowly moved away from the royal guard, she felt like the entire crowd was watching her every step. She could still hear the faint whispers from the people around her, the hushed tones of people discussing what had just happened. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, and she could feel the heat in her cheeks. She had never felt so embarrassed in her life. The whole square seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for some kind of resolution to this strange and uncomfortable situation. Emma's mind raced. What now? What should she do next? Her body moved on its own, as if her feet were guiding her away from the scene. She wasn't sure where she was going. She just knew she needed to leave the immediate area. She needed space to think, to breathe. But her legs felt heavy, and her heart raced with anxiety. She had slapped a royal guard, and even though he hadn't reacted, the consequences of her actions were still hanging over her. After walking a few more steps, she found a bench tucked near a small flower garden, a quiet place where she could sit and try to collect her thoughts. She sank down onto the bench, her head in her hands, feeling like the world was pressing down on her. Her chest tightened, and she could still hear the echo of that slap in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about it, how she had let her frustration get the best of her. She had never been one to lose control, but today, everything had boiled over in that one impulsive moment. "I'm so sorry," she muttered to herself, repeating the words like a mantra. But she knew that words, no matter how many times she said them, wouldn't undo what had happened. She had made a mistake, and now she had to face the consequences. But what would those consequences be? Would the Royal Guard report her? Would she be punished for her actions? She wasn't sure, but the thought made her stomach churn. She looked around the square, hoping that the crowd had dispersed. Some people had already gone, but others were still lingering, watching her. The cameras were still there, recording every moment. The video would be everywhere by now, and she could only imagine the judgment she would face when it spread across the city and beyond. A part of her wanted to run, to escape to a place where no one knew what had happened. But deep down, Emma knew that running wasn't the answer. She had made a mistake, and the only way to fix it was to face it head-on. She had to apologize again, not just to the guard, but to herself as well. She needed to find some way to make this right. Taking a deep breath, Emma stood up from the bench. She wiped her hands on her pants and started walking back toward where the Royal Guard was still stationed. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she knew that she couldn't just leave things as they were. She had to take responsibility for what she had done. When she reached the guard again, she didn't hesitate. She looked him in the eye, her voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I'm really sorry," she said again, this time more firmly. "That was completely out of line, and I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The guard didn't respond. He remained still, his gaze as calm as ever. But this time, Emma didn't mind. She knew she had done all she could. It was up to him now. And at least she had said what needed to be said. Her mind was still racing, but a small part of her felt a bit lighter. She had apologized. She had taken responsibility. Now all she could do was wait and see what would happen next. After Emma had apologized to the Royal Guard, she stood there for a few moments, hoping that something, anything, would happen to signal that the situation was finally over. But the guard remained silent, and the crowd's attention still lingered on her. It was as if time had slowed down, and she was caught in the middle of a moment that wouldn't end. People were still talking, though more quietly now. Some of them exchanged looks, whispering to one another. Others held their phones, still recording the scene. Emma felt her face grow even warmer, the weight of their eyes making her uncomfortable. She wished she could just disappear, but there was no escaping the situation. The moment had already been captured on camera, and Emma knew that there was no turning back now. As she turned to leave the square, she could hear snippets of conversation from the crowd. Some people were shaking their heads, while others seemed to be offering words of sympathy. A few of them looked disapproving, shaking their heads as if to say, "How could she have done that?" The whispers spread quickly, and Emma couldn't help but feel the sting of judgment in every word. By the time Emma made it home, her phone buzzed nonstop. She hesitated before unlocking it, already knowing what she would see. Her social media was flooded with notifications. A video of her slapping the Royal Guard had already gone viral. The footage was everywhere, on news websites, shared by people all over the city, and even posted by strangers who had witnessed the event. The comments came pouring in, some sympathetic, others harsh. Some people understood her frustration and believed she had acted in the heat of the moment. They wrote things like, "We all have bad days," and she didn't mean it. She just lost her temper. Emma felt a bit of relief reading these comments. It was comforting to know that not everyone was completely condemning her, but at the same time, there were many who criticized her behavior. "She should have known better," one comment read. "No one can get away with disrespecting the Royal Guards." As the hours passed, the situation only seemed to grow. The video had caught the attention of local news outlets, and the story was now making headlines. People across the city were talking about it. Emma couldn't escape it. Her mistake had become the talk of the town, and everyone had an opinion. The media coverage was both comforting and overwhelming. On one hand, it was nice to know that there were some who understood her side of things, who believed that it was a moment of frustration and not something done out of malice. On the other hand, the judgment and criticism felt like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. She couldn't help but wonder what the royal guard thought of all this. He hadn't said anything to her, and his silence seemed to speak volumes. Was he upset? Was he angry? Or did he simply see her as just another person who had acted out of frustration? Emma tried to focus on the positive comments, reminding herself that people made mistakes and that this would eventually pass. But she knew that this moment would stick with her for a long time. She would be remembered for this one mistake, and the video would follow her wherever she went. There was no undoing it, no erasing it from the internet. She had made her mark, and now she had to live with it. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the royal guard's calm reaction had made the whole situation even more difficult. If he had shouted, if he had reprimanded her, maybe she could have at least understood what she had done wrong. But his silence had left everything open to interpretation. The days after the incident felt like a blur for Emma. Everywhere she went, she couldn't escape the story. It was on the front page of the local newspapers, shared endlessly on social media, and even discussed by strangers on the street. No matter how hard she tried, the incident kept following her. Every time she opened her phone, her social media feeds were filled with more comments, more opinions, and more videos of her moment of anger. At first, Emma found herself obsessively checking the comments. She read everything, hoping to find someone who understood. Some people wrote supportive things, like, "She made a mistake, but we all have moments like that," or "She was just frustrated, and it shouldn't be blown out of proportion." These comments made her feel a little better. It was comforting to know that not everyone saw her as a villain. But then there were the others, the harsh comments that made her stomach drop. "How dare she slap a royal guard?" One comment read, "She should be punished for this." The negativity was hard to ignore, and Emma began to feel like there was no escaping it. As the story continued to spread, Emma started to hear people talking about it even when she wasn't online. She'd be in a store, and people would whisper about her. In cafes, she overheard strangers discussing the video. It was like her mistake had become the focal point of everyone's attention. It felt like everyone in the city knew what had happened, and she was unable to escape from it. It made her want to stay inside, away from the eyes of the public. But staying inside wasn't an option. Life still went on around her, and she had to face the consequences of her actions. Emma tried to focus on her work and her daily routine, but it was hard to concentrate. It was as though she was living in a world where everyone knew her mistake, and she couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. The weight of the situation hung over her like a dark cloud, and no matter how much she tried to distract herself, it was always there, just under the surface. One afternoon, Emma decided to take a walk to clear her mind. She walked through the same square where the incident had occurred, hoping the familiar surroundings would calm her nerves. The square was still busy, but it was different this time. People glanced at her as she walked by, and Emma could feel their eyes on her. Some looked away quickly, while others didn't even try to hide their curiosity. She wasn't sure if they recognized her from the video or if it was just the lingering feeling that she had become the subject of the city's latest gossip. Either way, the feeling of being watched was unbearable. As she passed by a group of people talking, she overheard a conversation that made her stop in her tracks. "Did you hear? She apologized, but the guard hasn't said anything since. I think she's in serious trouble." The words cut through Emma like a knife. It was the first time she had heard anyone mention the royal guard since the incident. She hadn't realized how much his silence had affected her until now. His lack of response had left her in a state of uncertainty, and hearing others talk about it only made her feel more unsettled. Emma realized then that, despite everything, she still didn't know what the royal guard thought of her. She didn't know if he was angry, disappointed, or completely indifferent. All she had was his silence, and it was driving her crazy. The world had moved on from the event, but Emma hadn't. She had learned a harsh lesson about impulse, frustration, and the consequences of her actions, but she also knew that life would continue. Eventually, the attention would fade, and the world would find something else to focus on. And until then, Emma would have to live with the memory of that one impulsive moment that had changed everything. Weeks passed since the incident, but Emma still couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The video had faded from the headlines, but the memory of her mistake lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't escape. She had tried to move on, tried to forget the embarrassment and the judgment, but it wasn't as easy as she had hoped. Every time she walked down the street, there was a part of her that felt like people were still looking at her, still remembering what had happened that day in the square. But as time went on, the buzz around the incident began to quiet down. The video, though still out there, no longer dominated social media or news outlets. People had moved on, as they often did with these kinds of stories. Emma slowly started to realize that the world wasn't as focused on her mistake as she had feared. The truth was, everyone had their own lives to live, their own problems to deal with. The attention that had once felt suffocating had begun to fade into the background. It wasn't until one afternoon, when she was walking through the park, that she finally began to feel like she was starting to find peace with what had happened. Emma was walking along the path, her thoughts wandering, when she noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench nearby. It was the royal guard. He was not in uniform this time, but she recognized him immediately. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him since the incident, and the sight of him brought all those feelings of embarrassment and regret rushing back. But this time, something was different. She didn't feel the overwhelming rush of panic that she had felt before. Instead, there was a strange sense of calm mixed with curiosity. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, and approached him cautiously. The guard looked up as she got closer, and for a moment, Emma hesitated. She wasn't sure what to say or if she should even say anything at all. But then, he gave her a slight nod, acknowledging her presence. It was small, but it was enough to make her feel like maybe things weren't as unresolved as they had seemed. She walked up to the bench and stood there for a moment, unsure of how to begin. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but soft. "I just wanted to thank you for not reacting the way I thought you would." The guard didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. But after a long pause, he finally spoke. "Sometimes the best response is no response at all," he said, his voice calm and even. Emma blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to say anything at all, let alone something that made her feel a little lighter. "I don't know how you stayed so calm," she said, feeling a bit embarrassed. I didn't know what I was doing. It was a mistake." The guard nodded again. But this time, there was a slight glint of understanding in his eyes. "Everyone makes mistakes," he said simply. "What matters is how you learn from them." Emma stood there for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She had learned so much in the past weeks, about herself, about her emotions, and about how easily things could spiral out of control. But most importantly, she had learned that mistakes didn't have to define her. She could choose how to move forward, how to grow from this experience. With a final smile, the guard stood up, his tall figure towering over her. "Take care," he said, before turning to leave. Emma watched him go, a sense of peace settling over her. She had finally gotten the closure she needed. She didn't need to keep carrying the burden of that moment anymore. She could move on, knowing that mistakes were just a part of life. Something to learn from, not something to carry forever. As she walked away from the park, Emma felt lighter, freer. She had faced the consequences, learned from them, and now it was time to let go. The incident, once so overwhelming, was just a small part of her story. And now she was ready for the next chapter.